The sale was over. A man named Henderson, who'd bought himself a future for the price of a used car, was shaking the bank attorney's hand. The attorney, a man whose suit cost more than the winning bid, was smiling a practiced, efficient smile. The dozen or so people in the community hall were already starting to scrape their folding chairs against the linoleum, the sound of an ending. Then a voice, not loud but clear enough to cut through the shuffling, came from the back row. "Stop the filing! That sale isn't final!" All movement ceased. The attorney's smile froze, a thing of plastic. Mr. Henderson dropped his hand. Every head in the room turned. A woman was standing. She was perhaps 70, dressed in a clean cotton print dress that had seen many summers. Her hands, weathered and certain, held a single folded piece of paper. It was yellowed with age, creased into a perfect small square. In her other hand she held a worn leather handbag, the kind with a brass clasp. She did not look angry. She did not look afraid. She simply looked like a woman who had waited her turn to speak and was now taking it. The number, typed in a faded ribbon-black ink at the top of the paper she held, was 81-C-227. It meant nothing to anyone in the room. It was about to mean everything. The room was the same one used for town meetings and pancake breakfasts. It smelled of old coffee and damp wool. A large American flag stood in one corner, its fringe dusty. The bank had rented it for the foreclosure auction of Parcel 7B, a fallow 30-acre field that had belonged to the Vance family for nearly a century. The attorney's name was Davies. He was from a firm in the city, sent out to handle these small, unfortunate matters with minimal fuss. He had a smooth face and the easy confidence of a man who always dealt from a position of strength, who saw filings and deeds not as stories, but as inventory. He had run the auction with a brisk, almost cheerful detachment. He had not noticed the woman in the back row until she spoke. Her name was Sarah Vance. Her husband, Frank, was 5 years gone. The field being sold was one they had let go, a painful but necessary concession to the realities of age and debt. But the barn, which sat on the edge of that field, was something else entirely. It was not on the list. It was not part of the deal. Davies let out a short, controlled sigh, the sound of a patient man dealing with an expected inconvenience. "Ma'am," he said, his voice pitched to carry across the room, a performance of gentle authority. "The auction for Parcel 7B is concluded. The property, including all structures thereon, has been sold." He gestured toward the paperwork on his folding table, as if it were scripture. Sarah Vance took a slow step forward, then another. She did not hurry. Her shoes made no sound on the floor. She moved like a woman who knew the exact distance to her destination. The crowd, the silent chorus of neighbors and speculators, parted for her. They watched her, their faces unreadable. They had all known Frank Vance. They had all seen this barn stand for 40 years. They were witnesses, waiting to see what kind of story this would be. To understand why she held that paper, you have to go back 3 weeks. The foreclosure notice had arrived, a formal and impersonal letter from the bank. It was expected. Sarah had sat at her kitchen table, the one Frank had built from 2 planks of old-growth oak, and read it over twice. 30 acres, Parcel 7B. She felt the loss, a dull ache, but it was a managed pain. The land had become too much. But the letter also mentioned all structures thereon. That was wrong. The barn wasn't on Parcel 7B. She knew it in her bones, the way a person knows the shape of their own yard in the dark. But knowing and proving were 2 different things. A few days later, she decided to clean out Frank's old roll-top desk. It was a task she had put off for years. It was his space, filled with his things: tractor manuals, receipts for seed, veterinary bills, half-finished crossword puzzles. The dust was thick. She worked slowly, methodically, not looking for anything, but simply wanting to put his effects in order. In the bottom right-hand drawer, tucked behind a stack of old farm journals, was a small grey metal lockbox. The key was on Frank's ring, which still hung on a hook by the door. She opened it. Inside, beneath his father's pocket watch and a bundle of letters she had written him before they were married, was a manila envelope. The paper inside was the lien notice. Filing 81-C-227. She read the dense legalistic text. It was a mechanics lien, filed by Frank Vance against the previous owner of the land, a development corporation from out of state that had gone bankrupt in the early 80s. The amount was for $12,000, the final payment for clearing and grading the land that they had never made. But there was more. A second page, stapled to the first, detailed a settlement in lieu of payment. The corporation, in its dying days, had signed over a deed for a small, oddly shaped parcel of land measuring exactly 1.2 acres, a sliver carved out from the main field. The barn stood on that sliver. She took the papers to the county courthouse the next day. The county recorder was a woman named Eleanor May, who had been in her job for 45 years. Eleanor remembered the developer. A lot of talk, no follow-through, she said, peering at the document through her bifocals. She led Sarah back into the archives, a room that smelled of aging paper and binding glue. She pulled out a massive, heavy book of parcel maps from 1980. There it was, Parcel 7B, a single large rectangle. Then she pulled a 1983 volume. The map was different. A thin line had been drawn, excising a small piece from the corner of the original parcel. In tiny, precise handwriting, the new piece was labelled 7B-1. Owner, Frank T. Vance. Eleanor ran a finger along the line. They combined it for tax assessment in the 90s, she explained. Easier for the county. But a tax map doesn't change a deed. A deed is a deed. They never unfiled this. It's still the record. Sarah folded the paper and put it back in her handbag. She had what she needed. She would wait. Frank Vance was a man who believed in doing a job right, or not at all. He had built that barn in the summer of 1981, the year after they bought the main farmstead. The wood was milled from timber on their own land. He'd raised the beams with a handful of neighbours, a community effort paid back in beer and barbecue. It was a good barn, solid and true. It was where he kept his tools, repaired his equipment, and taught his son how to change the oil in a pickup truck. It was where he'd taken shelter during a tornado warning in '88, sitting on an overturned bucket, watching the sky turn a sickly green. The barn was part of him. The dispute with the developer had been a quiet, simmering affair. The company had hired him to do extensive earth moving on the adjacent 30 acres, which they planned to turn into a housing development. Frank did the work. He sent the invoices. The first two were paid. The last one, for $12,000, was not. The company made excuses, cash flow problems, a temporary delay. Frank listened. He nodded. He did not yell or threaten. He just drove his truck into town one Tuesday morning and went to the courthouse. He filed the lien. It was a matter of principle. He'd done the work. He was owed the money. He wasn't a man who sued people, but he was a man who believed in the record. The lien was his mark on the official story. He told Sarah about it that night. "It's not about the money anymore," he'd said, stirring his coffee. "It's about making sure it's written down that they didn't do right by me." When the company finally went under 2 years later, their lawyers offered him the small sliver of land to clear the lien. It was a nuisance parcel to them, an awkward corner that complicated their liquidation. To Frank, it was justice, quiet and solid. He took the deal. The deed was recorded. The parcel 7B-1 was created. and the barn he had built now sat squarely on land he owned, free and clear. Over the years, the story was forgotten by everyone but him. The county assessor, for the sake of simplicity, lumped the two parcels together on the tax bill. Frank never corrected them. He just paid the bill every year. It was easier that way. Why stir things up? The deed was in the box, the map was in the book. The truth was there, waiting. He trusted the record. He taught his son, and by extension Sarah, the same thing. Don't argue. Just know your ground. Know where the lines are. He was a man who collected patience, not problems. He had planted this tree 30 years ago, a silent act of foresight. Now, 3 weeks before the auction, Sarah was sitting under its shade. Back in the community hall, the air was thick with unspoken questions. Sarah Vance reached the folding table where Mr. Davies stood. She did not speak. She simply unfolded the document and laid it on the table between his leather-bound portfolio and a stack of glossy pamphlets. The paper was delicate, almost translucent in the harsh fluorescent light. This is filing 81-C-227, she said, her voice even. It separates the barn from parcel 7B. Davies glanced down at it. He saw the old typing, the faded stamps. He saw an artifact, not a fact. He smiled that same smile again, the one meant to soothe and dismiss in a single expression. Ma'am, I appreciate you bringing this to our attention, but an old filing like this is almost certainly irrelevant.
The property lines are clearly defined in the bank's current survey and the foreclosure documents. He tapped a thick, professionally printed folder. Everything is in order. He made no move to read her paper. He was a man who trusted new ink more than old. Sarah did not pick the paper up. She did not raise her voice. She looked at him, her gaze direct and unwavering. It created a separate parcel, 7B-1. The barn is on that parcel. It is not part of the bank's collateral. Her certainty seemed to annoy him. It was a disruption to the clean, efficient process he was paid to oversee. This was supposed to be a simple transaction in a forgotten town, a box to be checked before he drove back to the city. He was not prepared for a history lesson. Davies decided to take a different approach, to dismantle her claim piece by piece with the confident logic of his profession. First, the legal theory. He leaned forward slightly, adopting the tone of a patient teacher.
An unrenewed mechanic's lien from 1981, he began, would be long expired, ma'am. Statutes of limitation are quite clear on this. It has no bearing on a foreclosure in the present day. He spoke the words statutes of limitation as if they were a magic incantation that could make her paper disappear. Sarah's response was immediate and precise. It wasn't a standard mechanic's lien. It was a lien convertible to deed upon default, filed against a subdivided microparcel. The developer's default was recorded in 1983. The title transferred to Frank T. Vance. It was never challenged. She was not quoting a lawyer. She was quoting Eleanor May, the county recorder, who had walked her through the dusty pages of the docket book. Davies's smile faltered for the first time. He hadn't expected that level of specificity. He shifted to his second angle, practical reasoning, the undeniable logic of official bureaucracy. He picked up the tax statement from his folder. The county tax records, Mrs.
Vance, clearly show the barn as part of the main property. You've been paying taxes on it as one single unit for over 20 years. He held the paper out as if it were an ace. This is the official record we operate from. Sarah did not look at the tax bill. The assessor's office combined them for convenience in '92, she answered calmly. That doesn't change the recorded title at the Registry of Deeds. A tax map is not a deed. The simplicity of her statement was unassailable. It was a fact, as solid as the concrete floor beneath their feet. Davies was now visibly flustered. His arguments, so effective in conference rooms and depositions, were dissolving against this woman's quiet certainty. He fell back on his last resort, a mix of emotional appeal and soft intimidation. He straightened his jacket, a gesture of reasserting his authority. Mrs. Vance, we're trying to be reasonable here. This is a settled matter. You're holding up the process for everyone. Look at Mr. Henderson. He's purchased this property in good faith. He gestured to the buyer, who was now looking deeply uncomfortable, a man caught in a story he hadn't asked to be in. Sarah Vance said nothing. She didn't look at Mr. Henderson. She didn't look at the crowd. She just looked at the yellow document on the table. Her silence was more powerful than any argument. It was a silence that said, I have spoken the truth. Now we wait. The room was perfectly still. The only sound was the low hum of the ceiling lights. The buyer, Mr. Henderson, a local contractor who had seen a bargain, now just looked like a man who wanted to be anywhere else. Mr. Davies, the attorney from the city, had run out of arguments. His confidence had been a thin veneer, and it was now peeling away under the steady gaze of Sarah Vance. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, an authority figure to restore order. His eyes landed on the county sheriff, a man named Cobb, who was leaning against the back wall, observing the proceedings as required by law. Sheriff, can we please proceed with the filing of the sale? Davies asked, his voice a little too sharp. This is an official, legally posted auction. Sheriff Cobb was a big man, slow-moving, with a face that had seen its share of local disputes. He had known Frank Vance his whole life. He'd helped him raise a wall on that very barn 40 years ago. He pushed himself off the wall and walked slowly to the front of the room. He did not look at Davies. He looked at Sarah. Then he looked down at the paper on the table. He picked it up carefully, as if it might crumble. He read the filing number, 81-C-227, then the short description. He stood there for a long moment, the document in his hand. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath. The sheriff was not a lawyer, but he was the law in this room. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old beat-up mobile phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then held it to his ear. The silence stretched. Davies checked his watch, a nervous, jerky movement. Sarah stood perfectly still, her hands resting on the clasp of her handbag. Eleanor, it's Cobb. Yeah, I'm over at the community hall. The Vance auction. I've got a question for you. He read the filing number into the phone, 81-C-227. He paused, listening. Can you check the original plat map from... Yeah, 83 should do it. He waited. The room waited with him. Sarah watched his face. He nodded slowly. Uh-huh. So 7B-1 is a separate deed. Still in his name? He listened for another 30 seconds, his expression unchanging. Okay. Thanks, Eleanor. He ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket. He placed the old document carefully back on the table. He turned his gaze to Mr. Davies. Eleanor confirms it, he said, his voice flat and final. The barn sits on parcel 7B-1. It was deeded to Frank Vance in 1983. It's not part of this sale. The words landed with the quiet finality of a judge's gavel. The auction was broken. The bank had sold something it did not own. Mr. Davies stood there for a moment, his mouth slightly open, the polished machinery of his legal mind grinding to a halt. The colour drained from his face. He looked at the paper, then at Sarah, then at the sheriff. For a second it seemed like he might argue again, but he saw the look on Sheriff Cobb's face and thought better of it. The confidence was gone, replaced by the frantic calculations of damage control. He quickly pivoted, his tone shifting from dismissive to desperately conciliatory. Mrs. Vance, he said, turning to her, his voice now smooth as oil. Clearly there has been a significant oversight by the bank's title researchers, a deep clerical error. We apologize. He was trying to frame it as a mutual problem, a mistake anyone could make. The bank is prepared to rectify this immediately.
We will offer you the full sale price, $7,500 directly, to clear this title issue and finalize the sale for Mr. Henderson here. He was trying to buy the barn from her, right there, in front of everyone. He thought it was about the money. He thought her victory had a price. He gestured to the buyer, Mr. Henderson, who just shook his head slightly, already reaching for his coat on the back of his chair. Henderson was a local man. He understood what was happening here. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a reckoning. Sarah Vance looked at Mr. Davies. She saw the panic in his eyes, the desperate attempt to salvage the situation, to turn his institution's failure into a simple transaction. She thought of Frank and the principle that had started all this 30 years ago. It was never about the money. She shook her head once, a small, definite movement. The barn isn't for sale. That was the end of it.
There was nothing more to say. The deal was dead.
Mr. Davies stared at her for a moment longer, then turned away and began shoving his papers into his briefcase with sharp, angry movements. He muttered something to the man from the bank who stood beside him, a man who had not said a word the entire time. The buyer, Mr. Henderson, walked over to Sarah. He was a decent man, caught in the middle of something he didn't understand. "I'm sorry for the trouble, ma'am," he said quietly. Sarah nodded to him. "It wasn't your fault." He gave a small, respectful tip of his head and walked out of the hall, the first to leave. The others began to follow, a quiet exodus. They filed out not with the excited chatter of a dramatic event, but with the subdued respect of people who had witnessed something private and profound. They glanced at Sarah as they left, some nodding, some offering a small, tight smile. They were acknowledging the quiet strength they had just seen, the victory of memory over assumption. In a few minutes, the room was empty, except for Sarah, Sheriff Cobb, and the two men from the bank. Davies snapped his briefcase shut and made a curt call on his cell phone, his back to the room, his voice a low, urgent murmur of legal jargon and apologies to some superior in the city. Sarah Vance didn't watch him. Her part was done. She walked back to the table, her steps measured and calm. She picked up the yellow document, the piece of paper that held the weight of her husband's integrity. She carefully folded it along its original brittle creases, tucking it back into its perfect square. She opened her leather handbag, placed the paper inside, and snapped the brass clasp shut. The click was the only sound in the quiet room. Done. There was no smile of triumph on her face, no sigh of relief. The straightness of things had been restored. That was all. That was enough.
Later that evening, as dusk settled over the fields, Sarah walked out to the barn. The air was cool and smelled of cut hay and damp earth. She slid open the massive wooden door, the one Frank had hung on a perfectly balanced track, so it moved with the push of a single hand. The last of the day's light slanted through the open door, illuminating the cavernous space in stripes of gold and shadow. Dust motes, disturbed by her entrance, danced in the fading light like tiny stars. Everything was just as Frank had left it. His workbench stood against the far wall, the surface worn smooth by decades of work. A faint smell of oil and sawdust still clung to the air. This was more than a building. It was a testament. It was the physical manifestation of her husband's character, solid, useful, and built to last. She walked over to the workbench and ran her hand along its scarred surface. She could feel the nicks and grooves, each one a memory of a project completed, a problem solved.
This was where he had repaired their son's first bicycle. This was where he had built the cradle for their granddaughter. She reached into her handbag and took out the folded lien notice one last time. She smoothed it out on the bench, the old paper stark against the dark wood. Frank Vance never talked about winning. He only talked about making things right. He believed the world had a natural grain to it, like a piece of wood, and a man's job was to work with it, not against it. Some things, he used to say, looking out over the fields, are planted for the next man or the next woman. The document, his quiet act of defiance from so long ago, had been a seed. It had lain dormant for decades, waiting for the right conditions to grow. Today, it had borne fruit. She left the paper there, resting on the bench in the fading light, a silent tribute. She turned and walked back toward the warm glow of the kitchen window, leaving the barn door open to the night air.
A single piece of paper can hold the weight of a lifetime. A story of right and wrong, of patience and principle, all captured in faded ink. But sometimes the record isn't kept on paper. Sometimes it's a number stamped on a small brass tag, riveted to a piece of machinery in a flooded warehouse in Ohio. It's a number nobody has looked at in 50 years. A man named Al Miller is about to find it, and the billion-dollar shipping conglomerate that forgot it ever existed is about to learn what it means. Stay with us.